EM Weekly starting right now, bringing emergency managers from around the world together to learn, share and collaborate.
Good morning, and this is the EM Weekly Show. This is your host, Todd, along with my co-host today, which is Dan Scott, who is the host of the new EM Student Show, which will be launching July 1. And Dan, welcome. Well, I guess you're part of the team here, so it's not even welcome to the EM Weekly Show. It's how are you doing this morning?
Oh, good morning. Thanks for having me back on. I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. A lot of craziness going on in the world and the news. You know, we've been watching these protests, this defund the police movement that's going on, and it got, you know, realistically, there's a couple posts going on in the chat rooms along the Facebook, if you will, with emergency managers and some stuff over on LinkedIn, and the question came up of how will the defunding law enforcement, what kind of impact will that have on emergency management? And I started thinking, I'm like, well, I mean, maybe it might improve it in one aspect of things because maybe there might be more money coming this way. But if you are attached to a law enforcement agency, could emergency management lose funding because of defunding and or the reduction completely, right? I mean, you have some communities that are talking about getting rid of their police department completely. So how does that impact us in the field of emergency management? You know, and I'm going to get my soapbox here for a couple seconds. So part of that goes into back to where I feel, and I've been a proponent of this for a long time, where emergency management is a standalone department within the city. With the director of emergency management or the chief, if you will, or whoever's in charge of that, whatever nomenclature that you would like to use, reports directly to the chief, to the city manager or to the mayor or whoever the chief executive is of your city. So I think that argument is even stronger now with this push to defund law enforcement, if you will. I mean, you have large cities. The city of Los Angeles is talking about it. Now, Los Angeles Emergency Management is a separate agency, but just to kind of say, it's not just the small agencies and stuff like this. It's those large agencies that are being impacted as well by politicians already coming up and saying that they will defund or they will move large amount of money from the budget from law enforcement into other services. So Dan, what do you think is going to be that impact on emergency management?
Well, let me just say that I absolutely 100% agree with you that emergency management agencies should stand alone. They should be their own agency answering directly to a city manager or a mayor, depending on how the city or county is set up. When I worked in Waco, at one point, right, it was just like that. The emergency management coordinator was right there in line with the police chief and the fire chief and answer directly to the city manager. And that's the way it should be. And we find right now is that throughout the whole industry, it's kind of all over the place. You have emergency managers who are in line with the police department and others who are in line with the fire department and some others that even in line with the local EMS agencies. So it's kind of all over the place. Ultimately, though, the ones that are strong, that they have their own department, that they are running, they're equal to a police department, a fire department, and they're answering directly to city or county leadership. That's the way it should be. But I think ultimately the way it's those that are attached to a police department or a police agency, law enforcement agency, I don't see that being a good thing if they're cutting money, because what we find throughout, statistically anyway, throughout throughout emergency management, especially in the United States, is that they're the most underfunded program already. Emergency management is. So if you're pulling money from an agency like a police department, and some of that money goes towards emergency management, I fear that that will negatively impact emergency management. And that's even if they have an emergency manager and it's not other duties as assigned. And if they do have an emergency manager, that they don't say, okay, well, we're going to eliminate the position and we're just going to give your duties to someone else, other duties assigned, spread out across several different people who may not know exactly how to to move forward with emergency management. And I think it can definitely hinder an emergency manager. But I think ultimately this can be used positively. We can, as emergency managers, it's a time to step up. And it's a time to show why it's important that we take front and center, and we can act on our own because of all the things. What's the number one thing that we do as emergency managers, right? It's the whole community. It's collaboration. It's reaching out to people. It's different than law enforcement and fire in the fact that we are actively seeking that partnership with others and collaboration with others and building partnerships. And I think it's a time right now that we could actually step up as a profession to actually make this benefit us. But ultimately, those who are right now, if departments are going to get defunded, I feel like it's going to affect emergency management in those areas negatively.
I wrote a piece and I put it up in Medium, and I'll share that in the show notes, I guess. And what it was about specifically was protecting First Amendment rights, and what the role of emergency management is during protests and civil unrest. And that's one of the things that I think that as emergency managers, with this whole community approach, that we are that intermediate, if you will. We are that third agency, if you will, that we can go out and we make those community partnerships and relationships, working with the community groups, working with the people. When we go out and teach classes on preparedness, when we go out and do the emergency preparedness fairs inside the community, things like this, those outreach programs, we are building those bridges already. And I think that as emergency managers, being that third service or fourth service, depends on what, where you're at. As we're doing this, not only are we able to have communications already established with some of the people who may be protesting, right? I think we could build that bond of trust between those groups that are protesting as well. Now, we're not just talking about protesting here when we talk about defunding, by the way, but I'm just using this as an example of how emergency management can be used in the preparedness section, or in the ability to reach out to the community to be resilient. And possibly you're right, Dan. I think this is that time for emergency managers to step up and come from underneath the cloud of law enforcement and fire department, and to move forward and show what exactly EM is. It's funny, I was talking to somebody about emergency management, this exact topic, and they work up in Oregon, and they were told by a fire chief that the emergency management has been what was the word that he used? It wasn't unchallenged. Not tested. They haven't been tested, and they're an unknown entity, and so he has no faith in emergency management. Fire chief has no faith in emergency management, and it kind of made me laugh, because I'm thinking, well, I mean, if you take a look at things like 9/11, H1N1 from before, the SARS crisis before, hurricanes that came across, emergency management is far tested in these areas. And I think it's just the lack of education in some cases for some of these chief executives that don't understand what we are and what the tool that they have in their back pocket is with emergency management.
And I think yeah, you're right. It's a lack of education, but it's also a lack of understanding. They don't understand how it applies. They don't understand one of the biggest things that I try and teach is that emergency management in general, it touches so many avenues of public safety in general, and we work with everybody. It's an all-inclusive profession. We work with PD, we work with fire, we work with EMS, we work with, it doesn't matter what level you're at, military, we work with federal, state, county. I mean, it doesn't matter. We work with everybody. And when I describe it, when I attempt to to lay it out on how it is, and I've gotten some really good results with this description, but I believe emergency management is the road, right? And each individual lane, we support them. We support that each fire's in their lane, PD's in their lane, EMS is in their lane, and we're the road that they drive on. We give them support, we give them direction. And by explaining it in that way and having to give an understanding, we work in planning and training and continuity. We're not just single mindset. And if you see, and one of the things that one of the reasons why I love emergency management so much is it's not necessarily always concentration on what's right in front of you. We got to think far ahead. We got to think far and wide. And when it comes to response mindset, they're right. The concentration is what's right in front of them, and they're trained that way. I came from a response background, and whether it was law enforcement, whether it was EMS, or whether it was fire, I did all those things because I grew up in educational law enforcement, and that's what you're trained to do. You're trained to respond to an incident and work that incident.
And you're right, and I say this a lot, that we do response really well, and there's the other aspects of emergency management. When I say we, the fire and police do response well, right? They know what they're doing. They go out and they do their job. At the end of the day, when the fire trucks go back to the barn and the police officers are back on patrol, emergency management is doing those other sections that go unnoticed in the way. And going back to the question, though, right? If we start seeing large defunding of law enforcement, and like I said, there's some large cities. The mayor of Los Angeles has said they're going to cut millions of dollars out of PD's budget.
Yes.
So if other departments and other cities follow that route, what happens does emergency management lose in those cases?
I believe they will in many cases, yes. Until in what we find though in these situations is that until the need arises again.
Mm, yeah,
so
absolutely.
so we have a short-term memory, right? We focus on what's right in front of us. But ultimately it's going to come back around to where we need emergency management. Something's going to happen and emergency management is going to have to step up. And as I said, is it going to be someone or a department that does it? Or is it going to be other duties assigned that spread out over people? And I've seen that happen. And it can work as long as they're given the support, the training, and the opportunity that's needed to grow a program. But ultimately, yes, I feel like it's definitely defunding is definitely going to affect us.
I mean, and you've seen this a lot, right? When you start seeing budget cuts in law enforcement, the first areas they cut are the professional staff, not the sworn staff. Right. And then it takes a long time to get down to cutting that, and training gets cut. And so it's so funny because if you think about what the politicians are asking for, they're asking to cut budget to the law enforcement. Well, they're not going to cut positions. They may not hire back, right? So if they do have some holes in their staffing, they just don't hire. Right. So they're not going to fire anybody necessarily. Right. So they're not going to hire back. They're going to cut training. Right. Which is the opposite of what needs to be done if you want to change the culture of policing. So they're not going to put money in training. They're not going to do community policing, such as like sending out like the officer friendly to go to schools and things like this. That gets cut. They're most likely, if they have any issues with patrol, right, they will either double up on a car and reduce cars because it saves on gas and whatnot, or maintenance on the vehicles. Equipment stuff starts going down. Those are the things that get cut easily, right? Because
they're going to do everything they can to keep the officers.
Right. And which is, I mean, and I'm not slagging that by any means because I think that's the right thing to do, right? But all these things that could actually help with the issue with the community and relationships with the community, if they see that this is the bad side, that's the stuff that's going to get cut, right? When they start cutting this. So the defunding the police department is almost opposite, it's same thing. Like when you talk, people are comparing this to school teachers. When you see schools that are having budgetary issues, they cut like the teachers' aides, they cut the lunch ladies, they cut different programs like that. They cut sports, they cut music, and they cut these things, and they shove more kids into the same classroom, and so the teachers are now overworked. So, same thing is going to think about that and put this on the law enforcement side. They're going to cut all those ancillary services, and the core. They're going to go to core services, right? You hear this all the time. What's our core mission? So, what's the core mission of law enforcement?
public safety, to keep people safe, to go out there and deter crime. So that's what they're going to do. But you're going to find that it's going to make it harder for them to do their job. So longer response times, you know what I mean? So that type of stuff that we see more, and that's our biggest concern already, is that response times continue to go up, even though they're continuing to dump funding and increase staff and officers. So what do you think is going to happen when we start cutting back money?
Right. I think I laid the argument is pretty much laid out for that. And, it's, again, and you start taking a look, you're going to see, longer shifts. You're going to see, you're already seeing where in areas where they're cutting back, that just areas of patrol are going to be, I'm stumbling over my own words because it's so frustrating of the concept. I was just talking to my wife, who's a social worker, and I know that she, was talking about how there are times when they have to call law enforcement in to help out because of the potential danger to the social worker going into these homes, right? And this is one of the things where politicians are saying, well, police officers shouldn't be doing social work stuff, but there's times when the social workers, need support. And, if we're going to start pulling the aid to social workers when they go knocking on doors, because there's areas that sometimes it's dangerous, right? I mean, in the case of what my wife does, it's she potentially, could put people in jail. She works for Adult Protective Services, and people go to jail for abuse, right? And so sometimes when she goes knocking on those doors, talk to the clients, the abuser's there and they don't want to deal with it, and so sometimes you need that law enforcement support. If they're not going to support the social workers, I don't see the social workers aren't going to feel comfortable going to the doors and knocking on those doors as well. So we're going to have those impacts as well. All right, so let's take a quick break here, listen to our advertisers, and when we come back, let's talk a little bit more about the impacts on emergency management.
Seconds count during an emergency. That's why at Titan HST, we're always inventing new technology to help people stay safe and help people who can provide help get connected with people who need help. At Titan HST, we've deployed mesh networking, allowing emergency communication even when networks are down, augmented reality, and real-time translation. We believe in the power of people to help each other stay safe and thrive.
I do want to talk a little bit about mesh networking right now. With what happened the other day with all the cell phones going down, hundreds of thousands of people were without cell coverage. I mean, some could text, some couldn't. I was reading some stuff on Facebook about some of the frustrations that people were having, and it's crazy. So, but with Titan HST, with the mesh networking, if you guys are using Titan HST, you can still communicate with your team through not through landline, but through voice, as well as chat and group text. So you check out Titan HST and let them know that you heard them here on EM Weekly, because during times of crisis, you do not want your communications to go down. Like right, Dan, I mean, every time we do exercise and drills, what's the first thing that or even events, what's the first thing we put on the board?
Yeah, communication is always the number one area of concern. And during an event and after action, it's always the number one area that people complain about, communication. So
right. So work on your communication needs right now. Titan HST is great. They're great people over there. Give them a call. Let them know you heard them here, and you won't go wrong by talking to that team. Man, so $1 million to LAPD budget, right? And it says it's 10 officers and it's what's controlled for overtime. I mean, is it really? I mean, $1 million. I think they wanted to cut like 1.5 million, but either way, yeah. But the thing is once you start losing officers, overtime goes. That's the other thing too. When you don't hire back, right? When you don't hire back, that means that you're gonna have to do overtime for those spots. And he's right? It's more expensive to run overtime than it is to run straight time officers. So
yeah, I gotta say though, I mean, I feel like they continue to do this, and what I fear is that they're gonna go more towards privatizing police.
What?
Yeah, that's what I feel. I feel like people. What do you do now when you don't have when you can't afford a police officer, right? They contract it out. That's what I fear.
So, you mean contracting out like through the sheriff's departments or through state police or?
There's cities and counties that that work together and do that type of stuff. But look at the response times on that. So,
well, yeah, and there are areas that are there are for sure where they are contracted out, and this, I don't want to say level of service suffers because the sheriff's officer in Orange County specifically where I live, Orange County Sheriff's Department, they do a great job, and especially in the areas where they contract. Right? I mean, it's like they have a person over there they call the chief of police, which is a lieutenant. He's he's chosen by the city manager, city council to work there. So they go through a vetting process, and he acts just like a chief of police would in a city. And the guys the officers are assigned to that city, and they do the best they can. Now you have the unincorporated areas where it's more rural, if you will, and yeah, the response time is longer there. So if you're just like any other rural area, if you're kind of in the way, you're not going to have a police officer in 5-10 minutes. It's going to be 15-20 minutes, maybe a half hour. There are some areas in California where there's one, especially in San Bernardino County, for instance, where there's one deputy that patrols a 10 square mile area, and they're by themselves pretty much. Maybe CHP might back them up, and I'm going to assume, and I don't want to assume all the time, but it's across the country, across the United States. I'm sure it's pretty similar in the rural areas. But what happens when you have a contracted police department such as the sheriff's department in say the city? Do you get that same ownership of the department as you do as if those officers and chiefs? Because now think about this: those police officers and the chief of police no longer work for you; they're contracted. So if you don't like that particular person, if Dan Scott, if they think he's a bad guy, a bad fit for that city, they just move him out of that city. He doesn't,
exactly.
So now you lose control over that. So there's this. Michael comes up, says most EM are grant funded. I don't know about most, Michael, but there are some that are, and cost share base, right? And many coordinate disaster assistance programs. Yeah, no, you're right in some aspect of it. I'm not sure about most are grant funded. There are grant funds out there for a lot of people, but the thing is, at the end of the day, is it going to be emergency manager professional fill in those roles? If we have those cuts in the budget, or does it become a collateral duty, which you can still use if you're going to grant from the position, you can still use those grant funds to fill using your collateral duty person, right? Again, here's an interesting part though, right? You talk about contracting, Dan. Do you think that maybe emergency management might be more on a contract need? So say you go with like a large, James Witt or Tidal Basin or Haggerty Consulting. Do you go with those companies to provide your emergency management services if you start having budget cuts, and then now they're on as needed and maybe a couple times a year?
Yeah, I don't know about. I mean, when it comes to as needed, it's good, to contract in for exercises and certain trainings, but to contract in emergency management just a couple times a year, I fear that. I would disagree with that. I mean, you need to have someone that's dedicated to that jurisdiction, knows that jurisdiction, and works their day-to-day responsibilities based around that jurisdiction. Contracting out, it can be great. And if you're going to contract out for the year, contract out for a position, that's the way to look at it. You can contract a position out from an organization that works specifically for your jurisdiction. That's one way to look at it, but you're going to pay a lot more than you would if you did it in-house.
Yeah, but where you save money on that, and this is the same way. There's a Lakewood model of running city government, right? It was Lakewood, California was the first city in the nation, I think, if I remember back in the day when I was back in my master's program, where they contracted every service. So fire, law enforcement, public works, everything is contracted out. Now I know they changed a little bit, but it's still called the Lakewood model. And Yeah, I mean, could you go back to that? I mean, let's look at this as a whole thing. If we're going to start contracting out police services, right? If you're going to defund the police department, get rid of your officers for whatever reason, because you're mad at them, and then we're going to go and we're going to contract with state or sheriff's departments. Mind you, in some states, just kind of let you know, it's kind of weird. In some states, the sheriff's department doesn't have the same law enforcement capabilities as say like California, where our sheriff's department does different things. So it might be state police that you're bringing in, like Massachusetts, for instance. The state police, they will do contracts for cities as well. So you go through, you get the state police or the sheriff's department in to contract. Again, like we talked about, you lose the control over who's working in your city, who's in charge, things like this. The city doesn't necessarily have great that ownership of them. Well, do you do the same thing with do you do the Lakewood model then? Do you just go, screw it, let's just contract everything out? I mean, or, are you holding some services back? It's just really interesting to see, some of the decisions that are being made, because this is one thing that people don't understand. And when I say people, just the vast majority of people, when you start taking a look at budgets and stuff like this, it's a rabbit hole that you're going to go down fast, you in most cities, you don't cut the funding from the police department and then put it into schools, which is somebody was saying, because the schools aren't run by the city. The schools are normally their own political entity. So it's not like I'm taking $1 million out of the police department and I'm going to put it over here in this thing. It's going to go back into general funds information, and that'll be dispersed how they want to do it. So on the budget side of things,
of understanding, it sounds good.
It does sound good. It's a good bumper sticker, right?
Yeah, it sounds good, but it's just a lack of understanding, and ultimately, but if this happens, and some are going this way, others are fighting back, and I'm very happy to see that. I mean, ultimately, I am supporter of law enforcement. You got a few bad apples doesn't mean that they're all bad, So, but I'm a supporter of law enforcement, and I hate to see that this is happening right now. But ultimately, what you're going to see is, if this does happen, the lack of community involvement, and you think you only see law enforcement in bad times now. Just wait, and I hate to think that this, and the reasons people are calling for it, there were some events that brought some stuff to light, and you're like, well, what's going on? But I don't think the best way to do it is by defunding the police. I think it's by giving them more training. It's a behavioral issue, a lot of it, and it's both on both sides, both law enforcement and the community in which they deal with.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's also interesting too is you're seeing blowback already from law enforcement. Yesterday, Atlanta PD had a case of the blue flu. A lot of officers walked off the job. There are areas that they're no longer, not just Atlanta, and some other departments where they're just not going to respond to anymore. And it goes back to Baltimore. Let's talk about Baltimore really quick, right? And this is some few years ago, there was an incident in Baltimore where an African American man was arrested, put in the back of a paddy wagon, and he died as a result of different things that happened back there. They're not really sure exactly how he broke his neck, but he broke his neck in the back of the car, and he died. So same thing. There's lots of riots, lots of protests, and so they pulled back. Basically progressive patrol, if you will, or preventive policing, and they went to just responsive policing over in those areas. They're not patrolling neighborhoods. And the other day in the Baltimore newspaper, residents in those areas where they pulled back patrol are now saying, hey, we need more patrol over here because crime has increased, violent crime has increased. And again, law enforcement's only responding. They're not preventing crime. So again, it sounds great on paper, when things go sideways and you have somebody who does something wrong. And I think that debatable. I know I have a friend of mine who doesn't agree with this. I think law enforcement does a very decent job of going through and getting rid of people, especially if they're the bad apples. You know, not perfect. Nobody's perfect, you know, at doing this, but at the end of the day, you know, they're trying to do their best as far as getting this thing done. You do this whole thing. You don't do preventive patrol. You're just doing response patrol or responding to 911 calls or whatnot. And now you have the residents asking for more patrol, more police presence in their neighborhoods, who a couple of years ago said they didn't want police presence in their neighborhood. So, you know, you can't win. You cannot win as law enforcement right now. And so it's a tough job. I know these guys and gals that are out there doing it, trying to do their best. But you have the cities that are cutting funding, and whatnot. And again, going back to the original question, how does it impact emergency management? I think at this point, you know, it's too early to tell, right? It's too early to tell if it's going to be a negative impact or a positive impact. But I think I'm going to say this. I'll go out on a limb, and hopefully, you know, well, we can talk about this later. But I think there's going to definitely be a discussion and impact on what the profession of emergency management looks like after this, especially those that are attached to law enforcement agencies. Dan, I'll let you say the last word.
Well, I think this is the time too that we should really take advantage of. If you're an emergency manager, you should definitely take advantage, step up, and help build your program. And don't take this as a sign of it's a doomsday that they're going to cut my position. Step up and tell them why they shouldn't. Step up and show them what it is that we do as a profession. Make them understand why it's important that emergency management becomes stronger, not weaker.
Absolutely, Dan. And again, thank you for being here again. And everybody, Dan Scott, July 1st is going to be rolling out the newest version of EM Student. Listen to him, support him, and we will see you all next week.
Thanks for having me on, Todd.